Have you ever heard of a house where the walls didn't just hold secrets but remembered the screams? A place where clocks stopped ticking, not because they were broken, but because time itself refused to move past one terrible moment. Where a woman lived under a name that wasn't hers, and a man carried a murder within his silence. In a village that chose to look away, the truth, like roots beneath the earth, kept growing until it could no longer be buried. Today you're about to unlock a secret that isn't just chilling to hear, but haunting to feel. It was just after 11 when Miss Lavinia Worthing, cloaked in a shawl stitched with memories and a quiet urgency in her step, arrived at the weathered doorstep of Miss Eliza Morrow's ivy-clad cottage, carrying with her a small jar of plum preserves and something far more potent, news steeped in dread and curiosity. As was their tradition, the two women settled into the sun-dappled parlor where time seemed to hold its breath. Fine porcelain cups were arranged on a lace-draped table, the silver teaspoons gleamed in the morning light, and the scent of Earl Grey mingled with the musty perfume of old books and rosewood. Outside, the village of Blackthorn Hollow slumbered beneath its illusion of peace, but inside, something had begun to stir. Lavinia, though in her twilight years, still carried the nervous energy of someone forever on the verge of remembering something important. With a breathless air she leaned in, her voice hushed with excitement and foreboding. "Eliza, you won't believe what I've seen," she whispered, stirring her tea so slowly the sugar dissolved like secrets in the dark. "It's Belladonna, that old cat from Grail Manor. She's been seen sitting outside the gates, every day, at exactly noon. Same spot, same time. Never fails." Eliza stilled, her hand pausing over her saucer, her eyes, calm but sharp, flickered with something old and instinctive, an alertness honed by years of listening more than speaking. "Every day?" she asked, though her mind had already begun to wander down corridors long sealed shut. "Without fail," Lavinia replied. "Mr. Alcott the postman swears by it, says he's watched her for weeks. She just sits there meowing like she's waiting for something, or someone." A long silence fell, broken only by the quiet tick of the mantel clock. Eliza's gaze drifted toward the window, where the silhouette of Grail Manor lay like a brooding phantom on the horizon, its stone face hidden behind wild hedges and the weight of 2 decades of silence. "But the manor's been locked for over 20 years, she murmured, more to herself than to Lavinia. Since Cassandra Grail's death, the name fell into the room like a stone in a still pond, and the ripples it stirred reached places Eliza had long kept undisturbed. Cassandra, the village's tragic jewel, with a voice like winter rain and a smile that never quite reached her eyes, had fallen, or so it was claimed, from the manor's west-facing balcony, one mist-choked autumn night. Some said she jumped, others hinted at whispers behind doors and shadows that watched. Eliza had been at the inquest, had watched the proceedings with her quiet, meticulous gaze. The official verdict had been swift and bloodless, a misstep, a moment of sorrow. But Eliza had always felt the absence of true mourning, the hollow rituals of grief performed by people too eager to forget. Cassandra's husband had remarried within 10 months, the staff had been dismissed with unceremonious speed, and rumors of a child, unborn, unwanted, or unspoken, faded like breath on glass. The manor had sealed itself shut not long after, as though trying to bury the sins carved into its walls. And now, 20 years later, it was a cat, an ordinary creature in appearance, but too precise in habit, that had begun to disturb that grave stillness. A cat who, like the past, refused to be ignored. Eliza felt something cold stir inside her. It was always the patterns that spoke first, the rhythms too regular to be chance. And as if summoned by those ripples, another name rose like mist, Mr. Archibald Pearce, a solicitor, dry and exacting, with a rain-slicked attaché and shoes that creaked with reluctance, had been seen ascending the overgrown path to Grail Manor just days ago. He was, as it turned out, acting on behalf of a London firm tasked with settling a dormant inheritance claim tied to a distant Grail descendant residing abroad. The documents were old, ink-faded and laced with ambiguity. And so, with the aid of the village constable, he had pried open the manor's great wooden doors, and stepped into the dust-choked corridors of a house that had never truly slept. The caretaker, a gaunt figure known only as Calder, had said nothing more than, "Be quick. The house doesn't like visitors," before vanishing into the hedgerow like a ghost excused from duty. Inside, time had frozen, mirrors still covered, candles melted to nubs, and a faint perfume lingering in the hall that smelled hauntingly like Cassandra's signature scent. Eliza knew then, with a certainty that made her fingers tremble around her teacup, that something was waking beneath the floorboards of Grail Manor, something ancient, something unfinished. And when animals begin to echo the same rhythms as the dead, it is never coincidence, it is a summons. Though the iron gates of Halbert House groaned on their hinges like a throat clearing secrets too old to speak, and the upper windows blinked dust-blurred and half-shuttered, as though the house itself had grown tired of seeing, old Harlan Drew still trimmed its hedges every Tuesday, with the kind of care reserved for things long past their use. His loyalty not bought, but bound by something buried deeper than the roots he turned with his spade. So when the London solicitor, Mr. Percival Gray, a man of pressed collars, punctual footsteps, and a habit of squinting slightly, when the world didn't make sense, arrived under a grey sky that seemed to lean in close, no one in the village raised more than an eyebrow. But Harlan, after the visitor spent an unusual length of time inside the sealed study, murmured to the butcher's wife that something was wrong, something he felt rather than saw, like how a dog shivers before a storm. He stood there, Harlan said, just stood still inside for minutes after the sound, like a chair dragging hard across wood, sudden and angry, and then, nothing, no steps, no voices, just a stillness I didn't trust. When Mr. Gray finally emerged, his face was ashen, like he'd swallowed dust and couldn't cough it up, and his briefcase, usually carried at his side, was clutched to his chest, like it contained not papers, but something that breathed when the latches weren't tight. He didn't speak, didn't even look up, just walked off with a stiffness that wasn't there when he'd arrived, as though the house had fastened invisible threads to his limbs and every step away pulled against them. Miss Adeline Crowthorne, who lived across from the vicarage and knew the shape of unease when she saw it, was told the story as she examined peaches at the grocer's, and though she didn't speak, her hand hovered for a moment too long over the ripest one before selecting a bruised piece instead. She knew Gray's kind men who balanced figures, counted commas, feared nothing they couldn't footnote. And men like that didn't go white from drafty rooms and old ledgers. There was something in that study, not a presence perhaps but a residue, a held breath, a weight in the air that hadn't lifted in decades. The study, once the pride of Halbert House with its inlaid floors, brass-buckled shelves, and fire-lit winter whispers, now felt more like a sealed tomb with a fireplace that hadn't warmed anything since the Halbert line had crumbled from scandal and silence. Behind a crooked bookshelf, its wood warped as though from breath and not weather, Mr. Gray had found something. An old marionette, dust-laced and cracked at the cheeks, its once delicate features now forever twisted into a parody of surprise. One of its arms was missing, the empty socket dark as if something had been ripped out recently rather than rotted away. Most disturbingly, inside its hollow wooden chest, he discovered a small baby's rattle, faded blue, the ribbon stiff, yet looped not in a bow but a perfect noose. No child's toy ends up hidden like that by accident. Mr. Gray, no stranger to logic, felt a sensation then that no law book could explain, like something in the room had watched him notice it, and was now waiting for his next move. He took a quick photograph, with the pocket camera he carried for documentation, but his hands fumbled more than once. Locking the door behind him, he left not like a man finished with his work, but like a man hoping he'd not just begun something far worse. That night, in the dim yellow of his boarding room, he wrote a letter, half confession half warning, but never sealed it. When his landlady entered the next morning, she found the kettle full but cold, his bed undisturbed except for the body upon it, lying with the calm of someone waiting for an answer that never came. No struggle, no sign of pain, just silence, like a breath that had stopped too gently. The coroner's report read, heart failure. But no one mentioned that Mr. Gray had no history, no condition, and no reason to simply slip away. Adeline, upon hearing the news while spooning jam onto her toast, paused only long enough to feel the air around her tighten, because she knew death rarely comes so tidily to those who've stirred the bones of old houses. And the village, with its tea-sipping gossip and soft-footed suspicions, began to murmur, not about the man, but about where he had gone, and more importantly, what had followed him home. No one felt entirely at ease explaining Mr. Harwood's presence at Briarcliff Estate that morning, not because he wasn't supposed to be there, but because the official reason felt far too tidy for the shadows it stirred. Technically, he had come on behalf of the law firm handling the estate's lingering affairs, but those who truly watched could sense that something deeper, older, had drawn him to that place, as if he were tracing the outline of a buried secret that had only begun to breathe again. When Miss Evelyn Crane reached for Miss Langley's teacup to refill it, Miss Langley glanced up and asked in a tone as soft as it was sharp, "Do you suppose Mr. Harwood saw something he wasn't meant to?" Evelyn smiled faintly, too faintly, and while her lips curved with practiced calm, her fingers gripped the china cup with an unusual stillness. "Some doors," she said quietly, "are better left unopened." Miss Langley merely nodded, but her thoughts were already shifting, pulling at old threads. That very afternoon, a chemist's assistant overheard the postmistress whispering to her brother behind the store's dusty curtains. A letter had arrived from a legal office in Switzerland, with ties to Paris, declaring the rightful heir to Briarcliff to be one Annabel Merrick, a distant relative of the Delacroix line, and entirely unknown to the village. The name brought no shock to Miss Langley's lips, only a soft and a glint in her eyes. Americans, she mused, had a peculiar kind of confidence, a way of walking into English rooms like they were stages set for their arrival. But what struck her most wasn't Annabel's sudden appearance, it was the timing. Harwood's death was still fresh in the village's memory, and now, as if summoned by the silence that followed, a new figure emerged with a claim too perfectly timed to be innocent. When Mrs. Greaves, the walking memory of every marriage, death and scandal since 1880, admitted she'd never heard of an Annabel Merrick in connection with the estate, Miss Langley felt a cold certainty stir inside her. Either something had been erased from the village's past, or something new was being woven into it. 2 days later, Annabel arrived at Briarcliff in a motorcar that gleamed like it didn't belong, stepping out with the poise of a woman accustomed to being watched. Her gloved hand brushed the door as she introduced the tall man beside her as Mr. Callan, her private secretary, though something about his posture suggested a different kind of duty. Their arrival didn't cause a stir so much as a ripple, subtle but undeniable, like watching the surface of a pond tremble when something dark moves beneath. Annabel's voice was gentle, refined, but carried a hidden tension, as if each word carried the weight of some old truth she hadn't decided whether to tell. She asked about the manor's condition, inspected its grounds with a cold attentiveness, and lingered a moment too long before the broken windows and empty corridors, as though something in their silence answered a question only she had asked. Mr. Callan, for his part, moved with the guarded elegance of a man used to shadows, and when Miss Barnaby later whispered, "Those two carry secrets like ghosts wear skin," Miss Langley merely smiled without denying it. The next morning, Samuel Briggs, the old gardener who hadn't stepped foot near the manor in years, appeared at Miss Langley's door, hands trembling, eyes clouded with memories too thick to name. They sat beneath the wisteria, speaking little. Then after a long silence, Samuel said softly, "It's back, miss. That feeling, like something we buried, is digging its way out again." Miss Langley said nothing, but in her silence was a question she hadn't asked aloud. Was this inheritance merely of bricks and land, or had Annabel brought back something far more dangerous, something never truly laid to rest? The village of Elmridge had always moved with a quiet reverence around Holloway House, a looming silhouette carved in ancient stone that clung to the forest's edge like a scar left unhealed. Generations had passed down whispers about it, some calling it cursed, others claiming it simply remembered too much. Its windows, now crusted with grime, seemed less like portals, and more like the vacant, watchful eyes of something that once breathed, something that never entirely stopped. Time had tried to erase it, with ivy, dust and silence, but beneath its crumbling facade, the house had begun to stir once more, like a restless sleeper, waking not with confusion, but intent. It started innocuously, with the return of Mr. Alaric Greaves, the old caretaker, who had once been seen as harmless, but was now a ghost of himself, bones wrapped in paper-thin skin, and eyes sunken with unspoken knowledge. He spoke in riddles, soft, tremulous mutterings as he wandered the graveyard at dusk, mutterings that clung to the air like fog. "The ground remembers," he'd say, "or it doesn't want to stay buried," and sometimes he'd freeze mid-step, staring eastward, whispering, "The roots, they've moved again." What unsettled the villagers most wasn't just his words, but the unsettling conviction behind them, like he was remembering something that had never made it into the local legends. He became especially obsessed with the East Garden, the same garden he had once meticulously tended, but now found unnaturally disturbed. On several mornings he would be seen hunched over the soil, fingers trembling above claw-like gashes in the earth, where it looked less like something had been buried, and more like something had clawed its way out. Miss Halbrook, the newly arrived schoolteacher, was the only one who truly listened to him. An outsider with a quiet sharpness, she had a knack for seeing what others ignored, like the birds that no longer perched near Holloway's roof, or the way shadows stretched too far near the iron gates, as if pulled by something underneath. She began to take note of strange changes, the sudden chill in the air as one passed by the house, the way the wind curved around it instead of through it, and the growing tension in the village's silence, as though everyone was waiting for something to happen, but no one dared say so aloud. Then came the night Holloway lit up. For the first time in nearly 20 years, faint flickering lights appeared behind the blackened windows, light that moved too slowly, casting unnatural shadows that slid across the curtains with a will of their own. Mrs. Carter, returning from a late-night wake, would later claim she saw a pale figure in the upstairs window, its posture rigid, its head cocked as if listening to a voice only it could hear. That same week, two things vanished: her beloved hound Jasper and the familiar chimes of the chapel bell at noon, silenced in tandem, as though the house had taken its first deep breath in decades. When Jasper returned 3 days later, silent, trembling, and with ivy wrapped unnaturally tight around his limbs in perfect symmetry, it was clear that something had marked him. The villagers said little, but fear began to seep into every conversation like water through cracked stone. Then, with unshaken resolve, Miss Halbrook did what no one else dared. She approached Holloway. She claimed it was merely to introduce herself formally, a gesture of civility. But as she stepped through the crooked gate with a jar of preserves in hand, her eyes held the quiet intensity of someone walking into a test rather than a visit. The door opened before she could even knock. A long, slow creak welcomed her, revealing a home thick with the scent of rot, wet ash, and something metallic and faintly sweet, like blood left too long in water. Inside, the silence was alive. Dust lay undisturbed on every surface, yet the floorboards bore fresh, wet footprints, small, bare and impossibly narrow, that led up the staircase into the dark. A single candle burned on the mantel, its wax freshly melted, the flame too steady, too focused. Near the hearth lay a torn ribbon, deep burgundy and snagged on a jagged plank. Beside it sat a porcelain shoe, child-sized and antique, one not belonging to any child in Elmridge, perhaps to none living. Her breath caught, but she did not turn back until she glanced through the cracked window toward the east garden. There, among the tangled brambles, the once dead rose bushes had burst into bloom, unnaturally vibrant, their petals a deep, almost arterial red, their edges curling black like burned paper. The next morning, Mr. Greaves was found dead, limbs grotesquely twisted at the bottom of the old well behind Holloway House. His fingernails were packed with dirt, his expression frozen in something between terror and pleading, one hand stretched upwards, as if he'd been reaching not for escape, but for something above, something watching. The constable, jaded and disinterested, dismissed it as an unfortunate fall, but Miss Halbrook saw what the others missed: the fresh ivy snapped at the well's edge, and two distinct trails leading to it, one deep and deliberate, the other light, skipping, playful. That night, long after the village returned to its muted routine, Holloway exhaled again. A sound drifted from the garden, not a cry, not a voice, but a soft drawn-out wailing, that rose from the soil itself, like the earth was remembering every unspoken secret, every wrong turn, every buried thing that should have stayed forgotten. From that night forward, the roses bloomed endlessly. Not even snow could stop them. They grew redder, blacker, hungrier with each passing season, fed not by water, but by memory. Beneath the restless fog that often clung to the village of Greystone Hollow like an unspoken warning, something quiet had begun to unravel, first as a whisper, then as a wound. It began with the sudden death of old Martin Rook, a retired archivist who'd lived alone in a crumbling stone cottage near the overgrown remnants of Ashthorne Estate. The coroner, ever practical and pressed for time, ruled it a simple case, heart failure atop the cellar stairs, unfortunate, but unsurprising for a man his age. But Evelyn Brant, a retired historian with a habit of walking where others turned back, wasn't so easily convinced. She had seen Martin the week prior, alert and full of quiet intensity, muttering something about a ledger he'd unearthed and a name that didn't belong. So when news of his passing reached her, she walked to his cottage, not out of mourning, but with the purposeful gait of someone searching for unfinished threads. The local inspector waved her off politely. After all, Martin had lived alone, no signs of foul play. But Evelyn, who had catalogued wars and betrayals in dusty records for decades, asked for one small favor: to see the body before burial. It was, she claimed, academic curiosity. The young officer relented, and Evelyn's gaze found what others hadn't bothered to see: faint ink stains beneath Martin's fingernails, as though he'd tried to write something with trembling urgency, and a single torn scrap of paper clenched between his fingers, so tightly it had bled into the skin. On it, barely legible, was one word: Barrow. No one in the village bore that name, not anymore. It had vanished like smoke from local records generations ago. That night, Evelyn returned to Ashthorne's ruins, standing beneath the collapsed archway where ivy writhed like it remembered. The moon was high, casting a cruel silver across the ground, and she saw, half buried in loam and roots, the rusted edge of what looked like an old iron-bound journal. She dug carefully, revealing its spine etched with initials long forgotten. She took it home and read through the night. It wasn't a ledger, it was a confession. The Barrows, once lords of Ashthorne, had not disappeared as rumored. They had been erased. One by one, over a single winter in 1834, they were quietly interred beneath the East Crypt, their deaths staged to mimic disease. But the truth scratched in margins revealed something darker: sacrifice. And the price had been paid to keep something beneath the estate from rising. Martin had found the book. He had begun decoding its older passages, and something had made sure he wouldn't finish. Over the next week, 3 more villagers fell ill, all of whom had visited Martin's house after his death. One began speaking Latin in her sleep. Another was found in the cemetery at dawn, barefoot and weeping, her palms bleeding in a spiral pattern. Evelyn knew time was unraveling. She returned to the estate once more, alone and armed only with the journal, and an old brass key mentioned in the text. She unlocked the crypt doors, pried open the gate long swallowed by soil, and stepped into the earth's cold mouth. There, among moss-eaten coffins and collapsed stones, she found a hollow chamber, empty save for a single chair, and a coat hung neatly upon it. Who clean, who recent. The journal grew hot in her hands. Behind her, the stone door slammed shut without wind or touch. She turned slowly. A figure stood where there had been nothing, tall, impossibly thin, its face pale and smooth like bone polished by centuries. It wore no expression, but its presence suffocated the air. Evelyn did not scream. Instead, she held up the journal and whispered, "I know what you are." And the figure, impossibly, nodded. The next morning, Evelyn was found on the church steps, unconscious but breathing, her hands covered in ink, and her voice hoarse from chanting in an unknown tongue. The journal had vanished. The Barrow name appeared again in the village registry that afternoon, unsigned, unexplained. And from that day on, the fog never lifted entirely from Greystone Hollow, as though the village itself had remembered something it once begged to forget. On the mist-drenched outskirts of Dovemoor Hollow, where the trees leaned like eavesdropping old men, and the soil held secrets tighter than any grave, something ancient stirred beneath the routine hush of village life, a silence too practiced, as if rehearsed by those who feared what truth might say aloud. Miss Harriet Wexley, whose manner was as soft as her shawls, and whose gaze often lingered longer than politeness required, returned home one dusky evening with her basket only half filled, and her mind shadowed by a note left beneath her iron gate, a slip of parchment creased and damp, with 5 words written in a trembling hand. He didn't fall, he was made to. No name, no signature, only dread inked into paper. Days earlier Walter Fenwick, the once faithful groundskeeper of the now crumbling Mallory estate, had been found lifeless in the drained koi pond behind the manor's east terrace. His death ruled accidental by the ever-hurried village physician. Slipped while pruning, they'd said, shrugging off the jagged bruises on his wrists and the half-moon of fresh skin torn beneath his fingernails. But Harriet had asked for a moment alone with the body, ostensibly to pray. What she found wasn't prayerful. There, wedged beneath Walter's left thumbnail, was a thin sliver of enamel, green and curved, like it belonged to something once precious. She tucked it into her thimble case without a word, her expression unreadable, but her thoughts now ablaze. The next morning, under the innocent guise of delivering lavender jam to Mrs. Crowthorne, the last housekeeper to have served at Mallory Estate, Harriet asked gentle, precise questions, and listened to answers filled more with what was not said. Mrs. Crowthorne, whose hands trembled not from age but from memory, admitted that Miss Eleanor Mallory, the manor's last living heir, had become strange before her disappearance 3 years ago. She avoided mirrors, whispered at the walls, and one night locked her door from the outside with 3 bolts, and still claimed she wasn't safe. Then she vanished. They said she left for the coast, or perhaps eloped in shame. No one asked why her journals were burned, or why Walter had stayed on, unpaid, years after his duties had ended. That same afternoon, Harriet approached the Mallory gates, surprised to find them unlatched. The estate loomed, draped in ivy like a shroud, its broken windows staring back like blind eyes. Inside silence reigned, the kind that settles after something terrible has been witnessed. Dust hung thick as fog inside the drawing room, and under the pretense of returning a borrowed book from the family's forgotten collection, Harriet ascended the creaking stairs to the 2nd floor. At the end of the hallway stood Eleanor's room, the door once padlocked, now swung open with a moan. Inside, everything felt paused like a breath not yet exhaled. A cracked mirror faced the balcony, its silvering warped as though time itself had turned its back. The writing desk remained untouched, save for a tarnished silver locket left beside a melted candle stub. Inside the locket, 2 miniatures, one of Eleanor, painted in delicate strokes, and another scratched out so violently the silver backing had torn through. Only the faint letter F remained visible near the hinge. Harriet's eyes drifted toward the French doors. Their latches had been hammered shut from the inside, the nails not rusted enough to be old, but not fresh either. Someone had sealed the room, after Eleanor vanished. Books on the shelf drew her attention next. All were classics except one, a copy of Wuthering Heights newer than the rest, its spine too stiff. Tucked inside, a hidden cache of letters, folded and water-stained, all addressed only to F. The handwriting was frantic, the tone pleading. "They watch me now," one read. "They will take her from me, come before they do." Eleanor's fear was not madness, it was prophecy. The letters, unset, and never meant to be found, told of a child, of a threat, and of betrayal. Harriet turned slowly as a floorboard groaned behind her. There stood Mr. Franklin Dale, the Mallory solicitor and long-time estate overseer, his face a blank canvas too calm for coincidence. "You shouldn't be here," he said softly, not surprised, but disappointed. Harriet smiled the way only she could, gently, knowingly, the smile of someone who never accused but always saw. "Locks," she replied, "are only for those afraid of something coming back in." As she descended the stairs, her steps light but her mind heavy, she understood. Eleanor hadn't left. She had been silenced. Walter had known and tried to protect what remained, until he too had to be removed. And the green enamel shard, it belonged to a child's brooch, the one seen in the old portrait in the study, now missing. Harriet didn't need to announce the truth. She only needed to watch who came knocking next, and who began locking their doors at night, now that the dead were whispering again. It was one of those strangely temperate spring afternoons, when the warmth felt borrowed, not earned, when the wind carried with it not just the scent of blooming hawthorn, but something subtler and more unsettling, like the ghost of a memory trying to push its way back into the present. Miss Elsbeth Crayford, the kind of woman who noticed everything and said very little, stood at the worn iron gate of the old Blakemore cottage, her eyes fixed on the movement behind the yellowed lace curtain, barely perceptible, yet undeniably there. That house had stood sealed in silence for decades. Ever since Vivienne Ashcombe, the disgraced daughter of the once prominent Harrowfield lineage, vanished under a cloud of whispered scandal. The story had been hushed up quickly, a nervous breakdown, a private sanatorium abroad, nothing more. But the village had always known better. Vivienne had been 5 months pregnant when she disappeared, and though no child was ever recorded, neither birth nor death, the rumors never fully faded, just shifted like dust in the corners of an abandoned room. And now, seemingly from nowhere, a poised young woman named Imogen had arrived, claiming distant kinship to the Ashcombes. She came with impeccable manners, a curiously vague backstory, and a man at her side. Mr. Alder, whose polished charm was only matched by the clinical precision with which he deflected questions. He introduced himself as a genealogist, a seeker of lost branches in ancient family trees, yet there was something about the way he studied people, as though measuring not their bloodlines, but their weaknesses, that unsettled even the most trusting villagers. A week before their arrival, builders restoring the attic at Blakemore had uncovered a bundle of tightly folded letters, hidden behind a false panel, bound in twine and brittle with age. They were penned by Vivienne herself, their ink faded, but the fear in her words fresh as if whispered yesterday. Phrases like "he knows about the child," and "the man with no face but many names," reappeared like a refrain, each line more desperate than the last. There were no addresses, no envelopes, only the raw ache of unsent confessions, as though she'd never dared trust anyone enough to post them. Miss Crayford had shown one to the vicar in confidence, and she'd seen his expression tighten, not with disbelief, but recognition. Later, during tea at Mrs. Merryweather's, who held the village's secrets like pressed flowers in the pages of her memory, Imogen had faltered when asked directly about her maternal line. Her eyes darted for the briefest moment to Mr. Alder, then she smiled a little too long, and spoke of destroyed records in a fire, of stories not passed down, of a heritage blurred by time. It was plausible, yes, but not convincing. Mr. Alder stepped in swiftly, his voice steady and reassuring, insisting Imogen had been under stress, that tracing lineage was an emotional task. But Miss Crayford wasn't listening to his words. She was watching his hand lightly placed on Imogen's shoulder, not in comfort, but in possession. The gesture was subtle, but its meaning was clear. Control. It wasn't the devotion of a servant or the warmth of a friend. It was choreography, and Imogen, despite her poised demeanor and soft speech, moved within his orbit like a dancer who had learned the steps but not the meaning behind them. The villagers, curious and easily swayed by well-dressed strangers, whispered their tentative approval, but there were murmurs too, of odd glances, of midnight lights in the attic, of rooms that stayed locked even during the day. And then, as if summoned by fate, Nurse Edwina Bell, long retired and near forgotten, approached Miss Crayford by the hedgerow one morning, her eyes clouded by age but her voice sharp as broken glass. Vivienne didn't lose the child, she said without preamble. She gave it away to someone she trusted, said it was the only way to keep it safe from him. Miss Crayford felt the ground tilt slightly beneath her feet. Him always a shadow in Vivienne's letters, a man unnamed, undefined, but ever present. If the child had lived, if Imogen truly was that child, then someone had worked very hard, for a very long time, to ensure the truth was not only forgotten, but actively erased. And now, that truth was walking the village lanes with polite smiles and hollow stories. That very afternoon, as the bells of St. Mildred's rang out across the green, Miss Crayford sat in the garden behind the vicarage, one of the letters in her hand and a storm of thoughts in her mind. The paper trembled slightly, not from the wind, but from the weight of implication. What if Imogen was not here to uncover history, but to rewrite it, to reclaim a name never meant to be hers? And what of Alda, whose calm voice masked something colder, more calculating? Guardian perhaps, but Gala seemed more likely. The truth, long buried under layers of silence and shame, had begun to rise, not with thunder or revelation, but with the softest of footsteps, and a smile that didn't quite reach the eyes. It was a morning draped in deceptive calm, the kind where mist clings low to gravestones, and secrets hang heavier than dew. Miss Edna Claiborne, a familiar figure in the village, and quietly feared for her sharp perception, sat beneath the gnarled yew tree in the churchyard, ostensibly sketching old epitaphs, but her eyes, steady and deliberate, tracked far more than moss-covered stones. At the stroke of the first bell, a subtle disturbance played out near the lichen-streaked gate. Cordelia Winters, the recently installed caretaker of the Grailhurst estate, paused mid-step beside Mr. Thornhill. In that instant, her spine stiffened, her eyes fluttered shut, as if warding off a memory, and her hand, resting idly against her coat pocket, curled into a silent involuntary fist. It lasted no more than a heartbeat. She recovered quickly, resuming her stroll with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. But to Miss Edna, who had long learned that the village's greatest truths came hidden in the smallest cracks, that moment sounded louder than the bell itself. The manor cat, now strangely vanished, had meowed at the same hour every day for weeks, an oddity few questioned. But the bell's toll, evoking such a visceral reaction in a woman supposedly unconnected to village rhythms, was no coincidence. Triggers of memory, especially from childhood, nest deep in the bones. They respond not to logic, but to instinct. Miss Edna knew then. Cordelia was no stranger to Grailhurst. She may not have known it herself, not consciously, but her body remembered. That bell had once meant something, an arrival, a departure, perhaps even a loss. And when the fire broke out in the west wing of the manor just before dawn, it was Cordelia's scream that raised the household. Flames, swiftly quelled by the village brigade, had already devoured the old library, and blackened the walls of the study. The official cause, faulty wiring, or a tipped oil lamp, was whispered with uneasy conviction, but Miss Edna arrived by mid-morning, summoned indirectly through the vicar's maid, who'd heard it from the milkman's wife, whose husband had been among the first to arrive. The manor still reeked of damp ash and scorched oak, but what lingered stronger was unease. Cordelia, pale and trembling, claimed she'd awakened to smoke and confusion. Mr. Thornhill, disheveled and distracted, repeated it was a terrible accident, yet his eyes couldn't stop flicking toward what remained of the library. Allowed a brief inspection, Miss Edna moved through the ruin like a historian in a desecrated shrine. Charred books lay melted into the floorboards, but among the debris, atop a half-burned writing desk, she found a scorched bundle of documents. The topmost was a baptism certificate, its edges curling with flame, the ink smudged but still legible. Francesca Eleonora Greaves, born nearly 20 years prior. The godparents' names were lost to soot, but the place of baptism, Craythorne Hollow, stood clear. Sliding the paper quietly into her handbag, Miss Edna understood this had not been an accident. Someone had tried to erase a truth too dangerous to leave buried, but like all secrets, it had refused to stay hidden. Cordelia, if that was even her true name, was not just a caretaker. She was tied to the manor by blood, by memory, by history thick with silence. Later, under the guise of arranging dates for the church fete, Miss Edna visited the vicar, and requested access to the old parish register. Its leather spine creaked like a confession, the pages brittle and yellowed, yet holding names that echoed through time. If Francesca had once lived at Grailhurst, and had been spirited away, renamed, forgotten, then Cordelia's every breath in that house wasn't coincidence. It was destiny dragging her back through smoke and time. At the foot of the manor stairs, Cordelia met Miss Edna's gaze with unreadable calm. Unaware that her past was no longer sleeping, it had awakened, burning its way back into the present, and it would not rest until the truth, long denied, was brought blinking into the light. The village's archives had long been dismissed as relics of a quieter age, little more than brittle memories tucked between yellowed pages and forgotten ledgers, but buried beneath their crumbling bindings lay truths too stubborn to die, and too dangerous to be spoken aloud. Miss Evangeline Hartley, the retired schoolmistress and unofficial chronicler of Ashgrove Hollow's haunted past, sat alone in the vestry, the shadows of evening thickening around her as stained glass windows spilled fractured twilight across the stone floor. Her finger moved slowly across a time-worn birth register, as though tracing the edge of a scar long healed but never forgotten. Names floated past like phantoms, babies swaddled and buried in the same week, mothers listed without partners, lifespans measured in mere days, until, lodged between the hesitant curls of a February hand and the careless loops of March, she found it. Seraphina Eleanora Vale, born the 17th of February. Mother Eleanora Vale. No father's name, no annotation, no whisper of scandal. Yet beneath the entry, where death or adoption, or any indication of what became of the child should have followed, there was only silence. No line, no note, just a blank deliberate and damning in its omission. The ink was pale but pressed deep, as if someone had wanted the words to endure even when the memory did not. Evangeline's breath caught. That name had not passed through village lips in years, not since the fire that gutted the northern wing of Hollowmere House, leaving only skeletal beams and scorched brickwork behind. But in that fire's aftermath, amid ash and ruin, she had uncovered something not meant to survive. Tucked deep within the crumbling frame of a child's music box, shielded beneath layers of soot and time, was a letter addressed to S, and a charred photograph of a solemn-eyed girl with the unmistakable cheekbones and wistful gaze of the Vale bloodline. The resemblance to Cecily Vale, the poised, articulate, and ever so carefully distant heir now living within the hushed corridors of Hollowmere, was more than uncanny. It was echo made flesh. Cecily, who spoke of America as home yet moved through the manor with instinctual certainty, who turned her head just slightly too soon before entering the west hallway, as though avoiding the gaze of the painted matriarch who once hung there, who flinched at the tolling of the church bell, not from startle, but from something deeper, something remembered. Evangeline had seen the signs, read them like annotations in the margins of a novel no one dared finish. This was not borrowed behavior, or convenient coincidence, it was embedded memory, the kind formed long before speech but never truly forgotten. And the inscription on the back of the photograph, scrawled in a hand that trembled yet hoped, had made her blood run cold. To my little Seraphina, hush now, you are safe. Safe perhaps, but hidden. No adoption records existed, no burial entries, no certificates, no guardians listed, only Cecily's own tale, an elegant narrative smoothed by time, and protected by those who had something to lose. The solicitor who once confirmed her inheritance had died in his sleep, sudden, peaceful, without files left behind, and the man now known as Mr. Lachlan, who served as her protector, her gatekeeper, and perhaps her jailer, had no traceable existence before 1921. He appeared fully formed, like a character conjured from the margins, his past blank, his presence constant, his silence louder than any denial. But Miss Hartley, with her boxes of village clippings and weathered memories, saw the pattern unfold like an unfinished melody. Seraphina had not died. She had been taken, renamed and repackaged into a legacy she never chose. And the real Cecily Vale, if such a child had ever breathed, might have disappeared with barely a gasp. As the night deepened and the wind whispered secrets against the leaded glass, Evangeline sat surrounded by brittle letters, fragmented diaries, and fading echoes of the truth. Tomorrow the church bells would ring again, just as they always did, but now she would be watching, not merely with suspicion but with certainty. Watching Cecily, not her words, but the way her hand tensed, the way her breath caught, the way something unspoken flickered behind her eyes like a flame too long suppressed. Because the past had not been buried, it had been smothered. And now, ember by ember, it was rising, not just to be remembered, but to be reckoned with. The invitation arrived not with ceremony, but with a quiet finality, like the closing of a long unopened book, an envelope of thick grainy parchment, sealed in crimson wax bearing a forgotten crest. A serpent wound around a flowering branch. It was delivered not by post, but slipped through the gate just before dusk, as though meant to be discovered by accident, as though the sender knew precisely when it would be found. Miss Aloan Briar, the last of the Briar line, and known for both her gardens and her silences, had extended a curious but elegant request for tea to Mr. Alaric Thorne and his ward, Mrs. Older Greaves, new arrivals at the once condemned Marrowwind Hall, a place that hadn't seen light or laughter in over 4 decades. That house, blackened stone, shuttered windows, and a crooked iron gate, had lived in the village's imagination longer than any of its residents, its history intertwined with whispers of Sibylla Thorne, the last woman to inhabit it before vanishing without a trace on a snow-choked morning in 1983. The tea was set precisely at 3 on a Sunday, when clouds hung low like curtains about to part. Aloan's sitting room was warmed with soft lamplight, and the comforting scent of lavender polish and Earl Grey, the fire humming low in the hearth as she laid out her finest porcelain china, with a barely visible crack running through one cup, like an old secret trying to resurface. Alaric arrived in a charcoal coat that looked older than he was, his demeanor calm, almost rehearsed, his smile just polite enough to pass for genuine, while Isolde, pale and striking in her restraint, moved like someone used to the weight of watching eyes, her gaze drifting not toward the people, but toward the corners, the shadows, the untold. The guest list was deliberate. Dr. Bram Halloway, now retired, but once the village's only physician, a man with a memory like wet clay, that still held every impression. Miss Agatha Nettle, former midwife, now half forgotten by all but those who feared what she still recalled. And Mr. Dorian Vance, estate clerk for Marrowwind back when records were kept in ink and blood. The conversation on the surface floated gently, talk of roses, restoration, and the rare blackbirds that had returned to the forest, but underneath it pulsed with unspoken threads, and Aloan, with the grace of someone who knew exactly how close to the edge to push, mentioned softly the western wing of Marrowwind, the one still sealed, rumored to echo at night, when no one should be there. Isolde, hand faltered ever so slightly, her teaspoon ticking against the saucer. Alaric said nothing, only sipped, but his knuckles whitened where they gripped the cup. Then, as though passing along a thread of memory, rather than a name, Aloan breathed it, Sibylla. The name settled like smoke in the air. Isolde froze. Alaric's smile fractured, and it was Agatha Nettle, absent-minded and staring into the fire, who murmured without preamble. She carried a child once, said it was never hers to begin with, but she'd keep it hidden for the child's sake, and the father's shame. The stillness that followed was surgical, cutting clean through the politeness. Alaric rose too quickly, thanked Aloan with the poise of a man retreating rather than departing, and Isolde followed in silence, but her face had changed. In the days that followed, Aloan began to assemble the past with quiet precision. A journal wrapped in oilcloth, buried beneath the rose bushes, unsigned letters tucked into a hymnal, and a baptism certificate with the name, Isolde Thorne, dated months before her supposed birth. Nothing aligned, not her age, not her origin, not her claim. The girl was no ward, she was the child Sibylla had vanished to protect, the child born of scandal, and buried lineage, hidden in plain sight beneath a new name, and a script penned by Alaric Thorne himself. Marrowwind had not been empty all these years, it had been watching, waiting, guarding a truth too dangerous to speak, until now. And as the clock in Aloan's hallway chimed midnight, on the eve of a storm, the name Sibylla whispered once more through the cracks in Marrowwind's walls, like the breath of a ghost that had finally found its voice. His shoulders were locked in a posture far too precise to pass for calm, more like the rigid brace of a man who knew at last that evasion had run out of road, and as Reverend Aldwich's silent glance summoned him to the dim candlelit east transept, Mr. Halvers obeyed without hesitation, his steps deliberate, heavy with the gravity of old sins finally catching breath. He offered no excuse, no defense, merely lowered himself into the cracked oak chair with the quiet, almost reverent bearing of someone who'd walked too long beneath the weight of truths unspoken, wearing guilt not as a stain but as a second skin. Lady Rhiannon did not confront him with anger. Her voice when it came was soft, even tender, like someone reciting prayers for the dead rather than indicting the living. She did not begin with the death of Clara Mallory, that cruel final chapter whose official version had never sat quite right with those who still whispered behind church pews. No, she began with a memory of a girl with quick laughter and wind-flushed cheeks, arranging wildflowers in glass jars beneath the nave windows. A girl whose light had dimmed not by illness, but by a slow, deliberate extinguishing, an emotional suffocation hidden beneath the guise of propriety. With each word Lady Rhiannon stitched together what had once been scattered: the hidden winter pregnancy, the hasty nighttime birth, the hurried summoning of a midwife who vanished from the village days later, her exit cloaked by rumors carefully planted. There were no hospital records, no official notices, only letters written in desperate ink, addressed to no one and everyone, folded away in a locked drawer like confessions too painful to burn. As the revelations unfolded, the chapel thickened with something deeper than shock recognition. Miss Elric sat motionless near the altar, her face blanched, fingers frozen around the spine of her prayer book, while Captain Wexley, once decorated for valor, found himself unable to meet anyone's gaze, his boot tapping in a rhythm far too rehearsed to be spontaneous. Then the name came like thunder behind drawn curtains: Marion, not spoken for effect but with the somber weight of a truth exhumed. The silence that followed was not disbelief, it was awakening. Lady Rhiannon's gaze rested on Miss Elric, not coldly, but with the impossible steadiness of someone who has waited years for the right moment to name a ghost. "You are Marion Clara Mallory," she said, her voice unwavering. "You were born in this village, baptized at Slain Elbers beneath the same rafters where your mother once sang in the choir. You were taken to Norwich as a foundling, placed under a false name, stripped of identity not by fate but by design." Miss Elric blinked, once slowly, memory stirring like sediment in water long undisturbed. "Your mother did not die of fever," Rhiannon continued, her voice now barely more than breath. "She died because her child threatened a legacy crafted in silence. Her father's will," she paused, letting the implication pulse in the quiet, "would have splintered the estate had Clara lived and married. But in death, unmarried and childless, the property returned to the old line, intact and uncontested." She turned then, her voice cooling into something almost metallic. "She didn't fall from the gallery, she was pushed, and the gallery was sealed not out of mourning, but to entomb the truth like a relic best forgotten." A tremor passed through the room, not noise, but a shift, like old bones settling beneath the earth. Reverend Aldwich's eyes closed, his long exhale, carrying the burden of too many funerals and not enough justice. "You were taken, renamed, erased." The town moved on, wrapped in the comfort of a curated tragedy. Lady Rhiannon's eyes moved from face to face, her gaze a mixture of sorrow and steel. "You were meant to forget, but houses remember, and so do the people who refuse to lie to themselves." In the hush that followed, no denials rose, only stillness, heavy, complete. The truth had not arrived like a scream, but like a slow and inescapable fog, curling into every corner, filling every crack. And now that it had settled, there was no going back, only forward into the cold clarity of everything they had tried so hard not to know. The name had once been shielded like a wound beneath bandages of silence, and now the very child whose existence had unraveled the tightly woven fabric of deception had returned, not as a whisper of scandal, but as the echo of justice long deferred. Cordelia stood unmoving, her face a portrait of restraint, yet her eyes betrayed the first shimmer of comprehension. It was no longer the numbness of ignorance that bound her, but the slow thaw of memory. Miss Alden turned then, the weight of recent events settling into her voice like dust upon forgotten shelves. Her tone was calm, her presence unshaken, but every word she spoke carried the resonance of sorrow accumulated across decades. "Mr. Tobias Gray," she said evenly, was not simply the old caretaker as many believed. He was a man who listened more than he spoke, who tended not just to the roses, but to the buried truths others pretended had rotted away. 22 years ago, he noticed something. Earth shifted unnaturally near the edge of the south orchard, footprints where none should have been, and petals crushed beneath boots too heavy for a garden. She paused, eyes sweeping the room like a lantern probing shadows. When a man returned last autumn, bearing a forged name and a claim to lineage, Tobias confided only in me, and with evident dread. Within 3 days he was found collapsed on the conservatory steps, his tea untouched, his heart stopped by means no coroner would question. But I did. She let that silence linger, heavy and breathless. Mr. Harlan, too, was beginning to speak. The baptismal certificate he unearthed would have rewritten the manor's history in ink even time couldn't fade. But that document never reached the registry. Half charred, discarded in the fireplace, its loss was no accident. She turned now toward Everett Lyon, her voice soft, almost mournful. There is no need for melodrama when murder is carried in a cup of warmth, a blend undetectable, administered with surgical grace, and timed with the precision of someone who could not afford another truth to live. Everett's breath hitched, but it was the twitch of his wrist, the involuntary motion toward his jacket, that said more. Miss Alden reached into her satchel and placed a folded cloth upon the table, unraveling it with reverence until a small, tarnished brooch gleamed under the light. Its crest identical to those worn by Everett's father, but this one recovered from Tobias Gray's clenched fist, fingers stiff with the defiance of a man who'd died, not of age, but of resistance. No man grips what kills him, she murmured, but a man struggling not to fall will clutch at whatever tears his sleeve. Everett's gaze flicked toward the brooch, then away, and in that gesture, the room felt colder. There were no denials, only the creak of the floor as he stood, the quiet resignation of someone who knew the end had been marching toward him long before this moment. No last protest, no dramatic confession, just a subtle nod, perhaps to her, perhaps to the memory of those already gone. The constable stepped forward silently, and Everett Lyon walked beside him with the stillness of a man who understood that reckoning wasn't punishment, it was payment. The village would whisper, as villages always do, behind curtains and over loaves, about secrets too brittle to hold, and truths too heavy to bury. But Miss Alden offered no verdict, only the belief that justice when it arrives, should neither roar nor beg, but simply stand, unshaken in the place where silence used to be. There was a profound stillness to Grail Manor now, not the brittle silence of mourning, or the eerie hush of secrets kept, but the deep breath-held quiet of resolution, like an old wound finally allowed to close. The ancient walls, once thick with the weight of unspoken truths, seemed to have exhaled at last, their breath heavy with stories long buried beneath generations of shame and sorrow. The manor was no longer veiled in the cold shadows of deceit. Instead, a fragile warmth threaded through its corridors, the kind that follows a tempest, carrying with it the scent of rain-washed earth and the aching clarity of aftermath. Francesca moved through its rooms not as a tenant or an intruder, but as a soul reclaiming a birthright shrouded in falsehood. She was both ghost and heir, retracing the memories of a life never lived, touching the remnants of a past that belonged to her in blood, though not in experience. Each object, each faded portrait and dust-covered relic, seemed to look at her with cautious recognition, as though the house itself was struggling to recall the child it had once hidden. She carried no bitterness on her tongue, but sorrow settled in her bones like winter frost, familiar and enduring. Her departure came not with trumpets, not with tears, but with the whisper of a closing door, a single bag, and the echo of footsteps vanishing through the side gate, the same threshold through which her mother had once watched the world, chained by choices never wholly her own. From her window, Miss Marple observed it all, the quiet dignity in Francesca's exit, the kind of justice that left no scars yet mended something essential all the same. Later, the village would read a small notice tucked within the folds of the Crowthorne Gazette, Grail Manor to be converted into a sanctuary for orphaned children, in accordance with the final wishes of Eleanor Grail and her rightful heir. No names were glorified, no past sins recounted, yet those who had watched the tale unfold felt the magnitude of the act. It was not a donation, but a quiet revolution. The manor, once a mausoleum of grief and mistaken identities, would now thrum with new life, the sound of laughter rising to ceilings once thick with grief. The gardens, long devoured by ivy and neglect, would blossom anew under the tender, reluctant care of Mr. Bly, who after much coaxing, agreed to return not out of duty, but a kind of atonement. Francesca refused to rename the estate, writing simply, "Let it remain as it is." Grail Manor was forged in pain, but it endured, and that is what matters. And so with no ceremony, no parade of redemption, the house began to breathe again. Miss Marple, folding the clipping between the pages of her book, murmured the sentiment she had carried all her life: houses, like people, are not to be judged by the stains of their origin, but by what they rise to become. And as the days lengthened and the season turned, the manor, still carrying the ghosts of the past, welcomed the footsteps of children with open gates, not as an act of forgetting, but as a choice to begin again. In the mingling of joy and memory, of innocence and inheritance, the house lived on, not in spite of its secrets, but because it had finally spoken them. There was a particular stillness that had taken root over Wren Hollow, not the idle quiet of countryside life, but the weighted, watchful silence that follows the unearthing of long-buried truths, the kind that lingers in rooms where names were once whispered like curses and eyes refused to meet for fear of remembering too much. The manor, which had for decades clung to its secrets like ivy to stone, now stood with its windows open, not from welcome, but as if it had finally grown weary of holding its breath through generations of deception. On the sun-dappled terrace just beyond the west garden, where lavender grew thick and stubborn around the edges of cracked paving stones, Agatha Lane sat with her tea, stirring absent-mindedly, as if each circle of the spoon might help her make sense of all that had unraveled. Opposite her, Mrs. Whitcomb, draped in a shawl far too heavy for spring, glanced toward the old church tower, where the bell of St. Aurelia's had just begun its half-past toll, a sound so familiar, it might have passed unnoticed, except for what always followed. "You can tell when a house has released its ghosts," Mrs. Whitcomb muttered, voice rough like dried leaves. "Everything starts blooming at once." Agatha didn't respond, but her gaze drifted to the far orchard, where new blossoms had appeared on trees believed long dead. Perhaps it was the soil, or perhaps it was something less tangible, something shifting in the air since the arrival of the new caretaker. She called herself Clara now, though that wasn't the name Agatha remembered from the last ledger in 1984, the one she'd once hidden in the rectory's forgotten drawer. Clara had returned like a shadow stepping back into the light. No explanations, no apologies. She simply walked through the manor's creaking front doors and began the quiet work of restoration, stripping back layers of rot, dust and shame from walls that had heard things no prayer could cleanse. She touched everything gently, like someone remembering as much as rebuilding. And still, no one asked her why she had come back. Maybe they were afraid of the answer, or maybe, deep down, they already knew. But stranger than her silence was the cat, the grey one with pale green eyes, and a left ear torn as if by some ancient struggle. It arrived without fail at dusk, never early, never late, and sat beneath the rusted sundial in perfect stillness. It meowed once and only once, precisely as the church bell struck 6. Clara never spoke to it. She merely placed a chipped saucer of cream at the edge of the hedge and returned inside as if she too was honoring some unspoken pact. The villagers said little, but Agatha, who had lived long enough to understand how memory doesn't fade, it ferments, noticed the patterns. She remembered the last girl who vanished in this village, how her mother claimed she heard the bells differently that night. She remembered how the manor's lights had flickered once, then stayed dark for years. And now, with every meow at every dusk, Agatha felt something ancient stir beneath the roses. Clara never went near the 3rd floor. She never unlocked the attic. But once, when the wind caught the drapes just right, Agatha swore she saw a figure staring down from the window, a shadow behind the lace. Still no one spoke of it. In Wren Hollow the rules were clear. You acknowledged important things once, then never again. The rest you carried in silence like a well-folded letter no one was meant to read. Agatha finally rose, her fingers brushing crumbs from her apron, the tea long cold in her cup. As she moved to take in the linens from the line, the bell rang again, 12 chimes, slow and sonorous, cutting through the hush with the same dignity it always had. And with it came the cat, tail curling like a question mark, green eyes fixed on the door Clara always closed behind her. Peace, Agatha thought, isn't loud. It doesn't come with verdicts or vengeance. It arrives like the sun after weeks of grey, not triumphant, but patient. It is earned, not declared. And in that moment, with the bell's final echo still trembling in the garden stones and the cat nestled like a sentinel beside the threshold, she realized the truth had not screamed its way free, it had waited to be understood. Justice, she thought, doesn't always wear a judge's robe. Sometimes it wears a second-hand cardigan, clips roses on Tuesdays, and listens more than it speaks. But before she turned to go, a question crept unbidden to her thoughts, curling around her like the cat's tail. If someone you love wears a false name not to deceive, but to survive, do you pull away the mask, or do you become its guardian? And in that choice, she knew, lived the line between revealing a lie and honoring a buried truth too sacred to disturb. And as always, we would love to know what stirred within you as the final echo faded into quiet. Was it satisfaction, sorrow, or perhaps that eerie stillness that comes when a story brushes too close to something buried deep in your own memory? Eleanor's choice, so subtle yet seismic, hangs in the air even now. Was it mercy or denial, self-preservation or sacrifice? Her silence speaks volumes, but so do the things left unsaid between her and the shadows of the past. Do you believe truly that every secret deserves to be dragged into the light, or are there truths so fragile, so intimately wound into the heart of someone's survival, that exposing them would feel more like cruelty than justice? Your reflections, your questions, help keep stories like this alive. They're not just comments, they're lanterns in the fog for others who come searching, drawn to quiet puzzles and the soft ache of human contradiction. If this tale of withheld truths, hidden motives, and the delicate unraveling of long-buried intentions captured something in you, we'd be honored if you'd stay with us for the next quiet storm. Subscribe to continue walking with us through mysteries that don't scream, but whisper, through stories where the real drama lives behind polite smiles and perfectly stirred cups of tea. And if you have a friend, a fellow secret keeper or silent observer, who might love a tale that unfolds like petals in the dark, do share it with them. It's always more comforting to ponder these haunting what-ifs together. Until the next secret finds its way to your doorstep, half forgotten, rain-slicked, and carrying the weight of someone's buried past, take care of the questions you carry, and thank you truly for listening so intently.